Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us today for the Space Industry Association of Australia and Bartier Space Governance webinar. I can't pronounce my own firm's name. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of this land. I pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and recognise their continuing connection to our land, waters, and culture. I extend my respects to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today. I'd also like to thank SIAA for putting on today's webinar. It's always a pleasure to collaborate with them. And for today, we understand that space activity is expanding at an increasing pace. We're seeing rapid growth across commercial, civil, and national security domains. And space, once the exclusive domain of governments, is now increasingly accessible by private players. In addition, considerations of sustainability, access, and cultural issues are now included in the development of space governance frameworks. With this growth and these shifts comes complexity. Law, policy, and governance a challenge to keep up as they are essential in shaping how space is accessed, used, and secured. Today's panel discussion looks at the challenges and evolutions of space governance, frameworks, and regulation. Some of the issues we will consider include how well do our current governance frameworks support innovation and sustainability? Where are the gaps in governance and law as new technologies and uses of space evolve? What does effective governance look like in a world of increasing congestion, competition, and strategic risk? We'll explore these and other issues with two leading experts in space law and policy. If you do have any questions, please put them in the chat function and we'll look to answer them as we go. Or if we don't have time, there'll be some Q&A at the end. Before I introduce our panellists, I'd like to say a few words about Bartier Perry. My name is Jason Sprague. I'm a partner in Bartier Perry's corporate and commercial law team and part of Space Law's team, which focuses on providing legal services, advice and guidance to organisations in the space industry. We work across the full breadth of Australia's space ecosystem and work with organisations internationally and domestically to drive success in Australia's space industry. Our clients include startups and established players across the aviation and space industries. We work with manufacturers, tech companies, universities, researchers, investors, and government agencies. That includes advising on space technologies and telecommunication services, launch facilities and sites, satellite networks, and complex space infrastructure projects. We help clients with advice on legal compliance, commercial contracts, disputes, insurance, financing, intellectual property, cybersecurity, environmental and planning approvals, workforce and safety compliance. We also advise on highly specialised matters from space debris claims through to personal space travel and estate planning issues with the space dimension. With our knowledge of the space industry in Australia, the regulatory landscape and legal intricacies, we guide businesses through compliance challenges and risk mitigation, ensuring they are equipped to capitalise on opportunities on Earth and in outer space. Through our support and involvement in the space industry, including as members of the Space Industry Association of Australia and American Chamber of Commerce's Space Committee, we make sure our clients benefit from our knowledge of both the industry and the law. Now, with the sponsor infomercial complete, it's a pleasure to introduce our two panellists. To my right, I've got Dr. Catherine Robertson, and to Catherine's right, Dr. Rebecca Connolly, and I do thank them for taking the time today to participate in today's panel discussion. Catherine is a lecturer in American Studies at the United States Centre and a senior research fellow at the Australian Centre for Space Governance. She holds a PhD in political science and specialises in political communication and its role in shaping US space policy at both domestic and international levels. Her research spans public opinion, political behaviour, and the communication of emerging space issues. In collaboration with ACSG colleagues, she co-authored the first comprehensive survey of Australian public opinion on space. Catherine is an active contributor to the global space community, serving with the International Astronautical Federation and participating in initiatives such as the UN Space Women Network. Dr. Rebecca Connolly is an adjunct associate professor at the University of Sydney Law School, where she leads the International Space Law Research and Teaching Program. She's a 2025 McCain-Fulbright Scholar at the United States Naval Academy and was a 2023 Thorley Scholar in International Security, focusing on space and national security policy. Dr. Connolly is also Chief Executive Officer of the Space CT Institute. Her research explores the intersection of strategy and legal governance in outer space, including commercialisation, militarisation, and security. She has guest lectured at Harvard University and Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University and holds a PhD and Masters of Laws from the University of Sydney. Now that I feel wholly inadequate, we'll start with the presentation and the discussion today. Again, just repeating, if you have any questions, feel free to put those in the chat function and we'll try and answer them as we go, but we will also look to cover any questions we've missed at the end of the session. Now, broadly starting, looking at current laws, we know that international space law was largely written for a different era. Rapid evolution and accessibility to space with private entrance and technical change brings challenges to the current international rules, particularly with the privatisation of space. So in your view, where does the international rule still work, and where is it struggling to keep pace with the changes that we're seeing in the space sector today?
Well, I think, first of all, we're seeing that there's lots of places where international law rules are starting to fall short, that they're not keeping up with the pace of innovation or the pace of who is doing the work in space. So I think that the broad principles are still applicable. So spacefaring nations are signatories to the Outer Space Treaty, which governs not only their behavior in space, but also puts a responsibility on nations themselves to govern the activities of their people who are under their jurisdiction in space. So I think that broad framework is functional. What's wrong with that framework is it's not, there's no enforcement mechanisms for bad behaviors. So that's where we see state level laws come into play. And those can vary. So the US obviously has quite a lot of space law. It's what I'm most familiar with. And that goes anywhere from how we do launches and returns all the way to the regulation of commercial activities in space. And the US has taken quite a forward stance on regulation of commercial activities in terms of saying that commercial actors would be able to benefit from any resources they bring back from space, but also allows sort of a looser regulatory environment to encourage innovation. So I think that's can be quite good for the industry because the industry is one that is takes a lot of money, but it also takes a lot of experimentation. And so you need to be able to have the room to fail without undue regulatory burdens. However, there is, an importance for protecting safety, not only of humans that might be involved in spaceflight, but also safety of the environment in spaceflight. And I do think if I'm looking, as the US as an example, they could probably learn from some other jurisdictions, Australia, which is a little bit more safety forward in terms of protection of environment.
Okay, so I might jump in too. And I think going back to the starting point about international law, I think I'd like to clarify that we do have international space law here. We have 5 international treaties. And so I think that there are 2 points I would make on that is you hear a lot, oh, it's unregulated or it's the Wild West. And I'd like to just clearly push that to the side and say it's absolutely not. We have international space law and it's been negotiated since 1967 when we had the Outer Space Treaty. The second thing I would say is those treaties and those agreements have served us well. They've served us well. We haven't had a conflict in space, and large and behold, they have been upheld and brought down into national law. Now, this is, I guess, the next point of where are we now and where do we need to move going forward? And this is where it's important to remember the limitations of international space law or international law generally, which is the non-enforcement mechanism. But the intention behind a lot of these treaties is broad principles. And we've had those broad principles, which again, everyone has largely agreed to, peaceful uses, free access for everybody, no nuclear weapons in space or objects carrying nuclear weapons or weapons of mass destruction. There's a number of broad principles. So I personally am a strong believer that when you have successfully negotiated 5 treaties, you don't tear those down. It's extremely hard to actually negotiate any treaty in the current climate that we find ourselves in. So it's more of a question of building up, right? We have foundation blocks. So how do we build up from those treaties and those foundational principles to introduce new concepts, new principles, new norms, or new hard treaty law to address where we see gaps? And that has actually been happening. That has happened. We have had new agreements come through. The United Nations COPOS, the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, which have addressed long-term sustainability. We've had long-term sustainability guidelines. We've had, they've addressed space debris issues within those guidelines separately with debris mitigation. And currently they have working groups on space resources to look at, new norms and rules and principles regarding, those activities. So I think that's kind of the question, is how do we build up from those foundational principles to address the new challenges that we find ourselves in?
Yeah. Something which I have looked at is law of the seas and maritime law in terms of frameworks. And my sort of view on that is it governs the high seas, both on a public domain space, but also it has private laws around salvage, insurance, and a whole range of things. Do you think that space law might evolve in a sort of similar framework with that public domain law and also the private law working together?
I think so. I think inevitably we will see new regulations coming through. I think what's happening is that we have two separate sort of areas which you highlighted, which is what's happening at the international level and issues that are being discussed and deliberated on at that international level, and then we have the national level. So there is an obligation under international space law for nations to effectively bring those principles down into the national law, and specifically for ongoing sort of supervision and authorization of their nationals' activities in outer space. Now, where Australia is interesting here is our national regulations have focused largely and almost solely on launch and return, and that's been served us well to this point. And now it's going to be a question, over the next, say, 5, 10, 15 years of what other activities do we then need to actually start legislating for to satisfy that obligation of ongoing supervision and authorization of national activities. So we've got sort of almost, I think you hinted at it, sort of dual sort of, negotiations in relation to space governance that are happening almost simultaneously moving forward. That's what's happening at the international level. And then also, I guess, changes in governance and regulations that need to happen at national levels, either because countries don't have national space legislation, or their space legislation might be somewhat limited, or in the United States circumstances, there's just new challenges coming in, and therefore new policies need to be implemented. So it's kind of a bit of an interwoven web.
As we know, law is not always the most fastest moving thing out there. And it takes a lot of time and effort to, especially internationally, to get agreement on even some of the most simple things. Yeah. So governments and industry do talk a lot about responsible behaviour and space sustainability. Now, if you had to translate into concrete operational expectations, what would you include in some of those practices? I suppose, for example, what should be expected around something like maybe debris mitigation, preservation, end-of-life disposal, and maybe manoeuvre transparency?
So my first thing would, any sort of common sense regulations has to address the debris problem. There are regulations that already do this. For instance, the US, anything above a certain weight must have a plan for deorbiting after its useful life. And that's a relatively new regulation in the last decade or so. There are also norms around destructive behavior in space. So I think you can't talk about space debris and responsible behavior without discussing anti-satellite tests, because they are a large progenitor of debris, 25,000 pieces. And not only debris mitigation, but debris tracking as well is really important. So when it comes to spaces, I'm sure it's probably preaching to the choir, but we track quite a number of space objects, but there are a class of objects that are lethal, non-trackable objects, so that we know that they could seriously destroy or damage a space asset, but we're not able to track them because they're below the trackable size. So I think space debris is really something that we need to be aware of, because the orbits that are continuing to be used, especially by commercial providers, if we think of satellite constellations, the LEO, the low Earth orbit, is very congested, and it's only going to get more so with many sort of startups now wanting to put in constellations that number in the thousands, and I think we're up to, is it 17,000 Starlink satellites? It's quite a high number. I don't remember the exact number. So
currently in orbit, I think they've just gone over the 10,000.
There's 17,000 satellites in space, and then Starlink is 10,000.
Yeah, they've just clicked those recently.
Leo.
Yeah, they're all in LEO. And they are maneuverable to an extent, but it's still, it's a very congested environment. And that is just an area that is ripe for the need for regulation. And I just want to go back to one of Rebecca's point is that we have to rely on the national bodies to do these regulations, which means we have to rely on national bodies that are willing to enforce their regulations. And that is something that can be a problem with some actors in space, that perhaps the national bodies will not be willing to enforce that or aren't concerned about sort of collateral damage. So for me, space debris is one of the most important aspects in terms of where we need to sort of get regulation right, because we don't currently have effective means of gathering up our trash in space. And then we also have to consider even deorbiting that then has an environmental impact back on Earth. So that for me is probably my most important area that we need to focus on terms of getting regulation and governance right, and getting that right through international agreement along with national regulations.
Yeah, I'm going to jump in there and say, I think what's really interesting that we started with space debris, because I feel like that is, in terms of mitigation, is probably one of the areas that we actually have the most agreement on, in that everyone agrees that this is an issue. And that's because we all need to use LEO, right? It's a pathway through. So if you continue as space operators to clutter and congest LEO from debris, not just active space assets, then everybody's affected. So it's kind of been an issue to address the mitigation of space debris. There's a lot of consensus around the need to do that. As Kat's highlighted, how we do that at a national level individually is a little bit different and not quite so certain. We are not even going to dip our toes into remediation of the debris, because that becomes a much more thorny legal and political issue. And that is just for confirmation on terms. So mitigation is mitigating your impact as a space operator on the current debris field there. And remediation is fixing up what we've already put up there. But the fact is, even just the act of launch creates debris. So we're seeing it being dealt with through national legislation. The movement and the trend is for space operators, when they're applying for their license, they need to, include a debris mitigation strategy that's given slightly different names under the different national legislations. But that debris mitigation strategy can then form license conditions, right? And we have seen over the last few years in the United States enforcement of your end of life plan under your debris mitigation strategy, and fines where that has not been complied with. So very important issue, and I think a lot of work being done, but we don't necessarily have consistency on it across the globe.
Consistency with those things, other environmental issues always varies state by state, and it's very hard to get consensus. But it's also heartening to see that there is that understanding, recognition, and ultimately, because we can't at this point in time remove the debris, we want to have as little up there as possible. And those strategies about return to Earth, mitigating the debris risk, is clearly an imperative. Otherwise, we can't use.
I think
effectively.
What's interesting is, I think, and maybe you're a bit more on the tech side, but that the technology to actually remove debris, we're not far off. That actually does largely exist. There are a lot of companies that over the last however many years have been working on different ways of remediating the debris that exists. It's actually probably going to be more policy and law that holds it up. And that's a legacy from our international space laws, where you retain jurisdiction and control. The launching state retains jurisdiction and control over their space objects, or sort of parts of their space objects. And so that then means you can't just clean it up. Right. So, and there may be circumstances where certain nations would not want their debris or defunct satellites
Could be military
removed. Exactly.
Security issues around that.
It's a good example of a difference between sort of the tech side of it and the technical capability side of it versus the law and the policy.
Catch up. Yep.
Yeah.
Fascinating. Now, shifting a bit, I suppose, more closer to home domestically. So, Catherine, in your recent brief, Harnessing Australia's Space Strengths for the Alliance, which was published last week on the United States Study Centre website, space is seen as an economic opportunity, particularly for jobs. Now, some of the stats is that the space sector in Australia has a $4.6 billion annual turnover, has 17,000 full-time employees.
There you go. We're back on. It just
Cut off.
muted you.
That's a bit. Apologies for that. Not quite sure where we got cut off, but I'll start from the top again. So Catherine, your recent brief, Harnessing Australia's Space Strengths for the Alliance, published last week on the United States Study Centre website, space is seen as an economic opportunity, particularly for jobs. Now, some of the stats were that the space sector in Australia has a $4.6 billion annual turnover with 17,000 full-time employees across about 620 organisations. The majority of respondents, around 53%, seeing the commercial space sector as important for the economy, with 11% not seeing that. The leading opportunities were seen to be jobs, access to sovereign space capability, and the nation being more competitive as a destination for investment and high-skilled labour. In addition, the Australian government's long-awaited 2026 National Defence Strategy and Integrated Investment Program was just released, and it sets out a potential investment in the space sector between $9 to $12 billion over the next decade. I think quite a few in the space sector in Australia are cheering that particular potential. So space is clearly acknowledged as a strategic imperative for Australia. Now, given that, looking domestically, with regulators trying to enable a growing space sector while managing safety, liability, and environmental impacts, what does a smart regulatory approach for Australia look like over the next 3 to 5 years?
So I think our regulations need to allow for companies to fail. That's a big thing. I think one thing that I have noticed in my 6 years in Australia is that there's a real fear of risk and taking risk and fear of failure. There needs to be room for risk taking and there needs to be room for failed projects. I will say I'm not a regulatory expert, so that might be better in terms of the regulatory side for Rebecca, but I can tell you what would be important for government to do. The first thing is invest. So the government investment in space cannot be solely as a customer of the international market. And right now we are more a customer than we are a provider. So in terms of being able to have an industry to even regulate, we need to have better government investment and also a government vision and strategy for what Australia's place in space should look like. So what that means is that we need to invest in something that we bring to the table. My recommendation from that report, the big thing is that sort of ripe for investment is space situational awareness, SSA, or and military space domain awareness, SDA. We currently purchase that data. For the amount of money we're spending purchasing that data, we could set up our own sovereign network and then turn into a provider of that data, become a regional hub for space situational awareness. This would be really important for Australia because we already have the knowledge and expertise and the infrastructure to do that. We have incredible ground infrastructure in Australia, but also we have world-class ability to analyze data from space. So for me, we have to look at government shifting their mindset from being a consumer of space to being an investor. Even the largest space economy on the planet, their commercial sector doesn't survive without significant government investment. So I think that's one thing that we really need to think of. The other thing that I would suggest in terms of any regulation, it's hard to regulate when you don't have a strategy. We do not have a national space policy. And so we can't say, well, we should regulate for this, or we should regulate for that, when we actually don't have anything driving what is Australia's sovereign goals in space. What is it that we want to do in space? So specific regulatory environments, I think is perhaps a better question for Rebecca, as I'm a political scientist and she's a lawyer. But in terms of the environment that allows for the industry to grow in such a way that it has a need of the regulations, is that we need better investment. And targeted investment. That doesn't necessarily mean, pull money away from other things, although I will mention that the return on investment for money put into space is at minimum 3 to 1 in Australia. So it's a good place to put your money if you want to, and that's just, monetary value. If you look at what citizens actually benefit from space. That's an entirely different conversation. But also having a strategy that lets the space sector know where Australia is going.
There are some probably green shoots with that. I mean, University of Tasmania was recently given a grant, I think in December, about $500,000, I think it was, to develop some space situational awareness capability and
Space
software.
Machines got one recently as well from Defense.
Okay, I can jump in. And this is actually an extremely complex topic, so I'll do my best to do justice to it in a small amount of time. But I think we need to start with understanding, the connection here between policy and law, and I think you hit on it. Which, although I'm a lawyer, I've spent a lot of time, in policy, because I think they need to go hand in hand, and that is, we need to understand the policy to be able to get the law and governance right. And I think that is, as Kat highlighted, one of the big problems we have here is that we don't have at that national level an overarching space policy, which then allows you to implement strategy and then ultimately law to give effect to the policy. And without that, we don't really necessarily have a clear way forward as to being able to create frameworks which will support the industry to grow. And at this point, I'll just diverge and then come back, and you both highlighted it. There are a number of things that Australia does very, very well in space. And so, although our laws at the moment focus just on launch and returns, we have a booming space industry. We have a lot of talent and expertise in, as you mentioned, space situational awareness, space domain awareness. We have expertise in Earth observation and geospatial, technology, particularly for disaster management, climate change, bushfires, maritime. We have that expertise. We have a lot of expertise in robotics and also, our mining equipment and know-how. So we've a lot of expertise in launch, right? Launch and returns. We're geographically blessed here in Australia, so we have that as well. As you mentioned, ground stations, our ability for radio communications tracking. We've played incredibly important parts of international missions in deep space communications, and we just even saw that recently with Atlas, right? So we have a lot of things that we do very, very, very well. And now what we need to do over the next, you mentioned sort of 5 to 10 years, is work out what our policies are. I agree, government needs to start thinking about that and become an investor, a builder in space, and invest in these capabilities with a clear objective. And then we need to have governance, and regulation introduced that's, I would say, based on kind of a risk approach, as in to allow clarity for our industry and pathways through for approvals and licensing in the areas that the government is supporting. And I think the biggest problem that we are facing right now, in addition to all that, is that when we talk about space and in Australia, it's siloed. So we have civil, and then we have commercial, and then we have what's happening in defence, then we have what's happening over here in national security, and it's very siloed. There's no coordination across that, particularly in terms of the pathway forward for regulation and governance. And if we had those overarching policies, we could then have some sort of coordination authority that would be able to oversee that from a governance perspective, to allow for clearer pathways for approvals for this technology backed by funding. And the dual use nature of space technology means it's becoming increasingly harder to just say that's a civil project, or that's even national security. We're seeing this interwoven nature of it, which without a coordination authority means it's harder.
It's almost impossible for commercial space companies in Australia to be anything but looking at dual use, because there's not a viable commercial sector.
Correct.
In Australia. The other point that I would say just before we move on is we're also world class in space research in terms of like astronomy in Australia. And this is where I think we have a really unique opportunity to be vocal on the world stage about policies around the protection of the space environment for astronomy, because we have tens of thousands of years of expertise in sky country that can contribute to astronomy. And we have some really amazing Indigenous astronomers who are vocal and talk about this within Australia. And I said, so when we have these conversations, sometimes and I can be guilty of this myself. I get stuck into sort of national space strategy, national this, and we need to also take a step back and think, the science that we do is also really important and a really important part of that. And Australia in particular, I think, has great expertise to contribute to how we protect the ability of scientists to do their work.
And I think that's why I think we need that national policy and and a coordination effort, because they're trying to balance a lot of different things. We're balancing, supporting commercial innovation, we're balancing scientific discovery, but we're balancing that against national security interests, protecting that critical infrastructure interests, and we're balancing it against also the impact potentially on in space from in-space activities.
That's the point that you made about space being siloed. While we tend to silo the policy, space itself is not actually.
It's not siloed, exactly.
More, I think 23 or 25 different portfolios that rely on space, and we rely on space every day to even do what we're doing here or how I got here this morning. So there just needs to be a recognition at that national federal level within like the prime minister and cabinet that space is something that deserves a national strategy.
I think also coming to the siloed side of things as well, it makes it very hard for commercial operators as well in terms of regulatory and legal compliance. And there's a bunch of different areas you have to tick the boxes for to do even some of the more simple things. And while an overarching regulator may not necessarily simplify everything completely, the current framework that we do have at the moment does make it difficult for people in the space sector trying to enter it, manage all those different legal and regulatory requirements because they operate so siloed, as you say. There's not always communication or consistency in terms of how the laws might be applied. And I've seen that working for some clients as well. We're sort of trying to do one thing. It's like, well, actually, have you thought about this because you fall into this particular bucket because it's legislation? And suddenly it's like, oh, we hadn't thought of that. And suddenly it's like, that's a problem with our funding, our program, our timetables. It can set things back quite significantly.
Agreed. And I think that's why we're at an extremely unique point in time right now, because the Australian space industry, in terms of the commercial side, it's there. We have this expertise, with a lot of talent, and we see it's going to continue to grow. We're not as big and robust and as say the United States, but we're going to be facing the same challenges, right? So those issues that you've mentioned, from continuing of space activities over the next decade, we're going to see those challenges arise, and our law will need to adapt to those new issues, which at the moment it's, as I said, largely focused on just a launch and return authorizations and permits and spaceports, high-powered rockets. But what's interesting is that right now we haven't got to the point where all those activities are happening yet. So we have that really unique point in time where the government has a chance to go, what's our policy? What's our strategy? What do we need to govern? What new laws will we need? And how do we balance everything? And then start putting that framework in before it's gone too far, right? And then you're backpedaling, and then you've got gaps, and then you're trying to catch up, and then you're, it's almost like then you're having discussions in crisis mode, and we're not in that mode. So that's why I think this is actually really exciting for a time to be in working in this area.
From my experience in looking at some of these issues as well, I feel there's a bit of a let's let someone else take the lead on these things first, and we'll see how they do it or what the learnings are from some of those experiences. And you look at some of the more the larger spacefaring nations. So the US is clearly the obvious one, but you also got Russia, China, all coming through. Japan as well has a space, great space sector, and they're facing the same challenges. So I just wonder if there's a little bit of our government thinking, well, let's see what they do first, rather than repeating mistakes potentially.
I think it's the government should look to what other nations have done as an example and say what has worked here, what hasn't, how can we adjust our legislation. But the problems that we're going to face are going to be really similar across, whether it's, the US, China, Russia. I mean, Russia's problem is that it has no money. Japan.
All the money's filtered into their military.
Yes. Yes. But I mean, Japan's a really interesting case. In fact, Japan is about to be investing money here in our space industry. So I think looking ahead and saying like we're not sure is not a good excuse, right? We have, I think, as Rebecca mentioned, there's this real opportunity to put in right size regulation now instead of having to go back and fix mistakes when they happen. We can look and say, this is what we want our space strategy. This is what we want Australian space to look like. And then we can work from there. And we can look at commercial space laws in other countries. We can look at defense laws. We can look at launch and returns, but we can also look at the use of AI in space. That's going to be an incredibly important conversation that's already starting because it's, AI not only for commercial uses, but AI in defense and national security. There's really a lot of opportunity to put in the right regulations and the right legal frameworks. And I think it would be a shame to see that opportunity wasted.
Yeah, I think I'd comment that, when you start talking about laws and regulations, and you get this, Jason, everyone's like, lawyers, we hate lawyers. And it's like, it's not what you want to say at like, the cocktail party. What do? You don't want to mention you're a lawyer because no one wants to talk to you anymore. But I think there's a misconception that law is restrictive, and it doesn't have to be restrictive. In fact, well-written law will actually make approval processes faster, right? And it will give clarity on to space operators about what they need to do to satisfy those requirements to get, their approvals in a safe and sustainable, framework. I think second, I'm certainly not suggesting, I know Kat is in it as well, that we're saying Australian government, go ahead, you have to fill every gap and have a comprehensive space regime. Legal regime. That's not at all, I think, the way forward. I think it's more relevant for them to look at what is Australia doing? What activities do we do? Or what activities at least do they want to focus on and fund as well, which is why it links. And it's those activities that Australia is either already doing with our amazing space industry and researchers, or which the Australian government wishes to pursue. It's those activities that need to be regulated. That's not everything. Yeah. So that is its focus. It should be the focus.
And the right regulation, as you said, just like with laws, the right regulation actually enables what you want to see because it gives a clear framework. Yeah. And people need frameworks, I think.
And I think also you mentioned some of our partners, allies, particularly say Japan. I think if we want to and should be focusing on boosting those relationships with our partners and allies, then we need to have laws and governance and policy that actually meets our partners where they're at in terms of governance, and to allow for this international cooperation to continue. And there needs to be some sort of consistency across regimes and clarity across legal regimes. And that brings it back to an international issue, which is where we started.
Well, it's like, in particular, the case of Japan has very clear guardrails for itself in terms of working with space. If they're doing a civil project, that project must be a civil project. There can be no crossover into defense because of the way that their own regulatory framework works. So being aware of the people with whom we will be working is really important, because we need to make sure that our regulation doesn't cause issues or put sort of sandpaper between those working relationships. I mean, I again am quite sure I am preaching to the choir when I talk about this, because everyone's probably thinking ITAR, right? Because that is one of those big regulation restrictions that can really throw some gunk into the gears when trying to work in space. And of course, AUKUS Pillar 2 and technology safeguard agreements have recently worked to sort of address those to make it easier for us to cooperate in space under those restrictions, but it's just something you have to be aware of.
I think also in terms of laws and how they're applied and what regimes are put in place, I see this in other sectors, other areas, but there's always this a tension between having prescriptive laws, and there's great things for frameworks, versus kind of more outcomes-based frameworks and laws. My experience with a lot of clients, when they're outcomes-based, is they say, well, tell me what I have to do. It's like, well, actually, it's quite broad. Where do you sit in terms of your organisation, how it's done? There's a lot of flexibility in how to apply these frameworks and principles, depending on who you are, what your sophistication is, what your resources are. And a lot of clients find that very frustrating. So I just wonder if you've got a thought about prescription versus a bit more flexibility in some of these frameworks.
I do. Do you want me to jump in here a little bit? And I think I'll, for our audience, and I don't know how many of them are like lawyers, so that sort of phraseology might not resonate, but I think I like to draw a comparison to say environmental impact statements there, where when you have to, you were looking to do something and you have to, it's going to affect the environment in your project, you have to put together an environmental impact statement. We have like decades of, knowledge about what needs to go into one of those, and what, if you're working with clients as you are, and if you're doing things involving environmental impact statements, you would have an idea of what the regulator expects. And so you would know these are the sort of things that you giving advice to clients, these are the sort of things you need to cover. These are the things that are going to hold your project up, or these are what we need to get this report and this. And that's built over, 30 years of working on those things. We don't have that here with space. We don't have that history and backlog. So this is where the laws, in terms of whether they're prescriptive or permissive or restrictive, becomes difficult, because when you create laws that have that flexibility and that openness, which effectively a bit is what an EIS is allowing you to do, is put forward your proposal and telling the government what impact it's going to have. And when you have this in space, you have this problem of, I don't really know what the regulator is going to want me to give them. And so that can become a frustration, and that can hold up authorizations and permits. But the upside of that is, that flexibility does allow for dialogue and communication back and forth. Where I think the balance needs to be struck, and where I don't, and given where our laws for space here are quite young in Australia, is actually institutional knowledge. Right, is focusing on not just what regulations and what governance we're going to enact here, but how are we going to continue sort of a pipeline of institutional capability within our government to know that there's frameworks around those answers. So when your client says to you, what do I need to put in? You have those connections with the regulator, and you have that sort of backstory of knowing, well, this is the sort of things that they're going to want. And without having that institutional, legacy with capability, then that becomes harder. If you keep having, a new person or a new division or a new, then those frameworks don't continue. So that's going to take time. We've got to build up time to be able to do that. And I think it can also be done deliberately by building up an institutional sort of framework for ongoing capabilities. Does that make sense what I'm saying there? So that there is a little bit more certainty, even though you've kept the legislation and the governance open and a bit more flexible, you still have some certainty as to what you need to provide.
I think the beauty also sometimes there's more permissive frameworks is they're designed to adapt.
Correct.
And you need that flexibility as well going forward, particularly in an area where we are young, we are learning, there are new things happening. Otherwise, if it's too prescriptive, then you have the difficulty of changing those things.
Yes.
And lots of arguments for and against, and it can become a very locked process.
But I think where I'm coming as well, and I think that's right, is still in that openness and that flexibility, you're relying on who literally is sitting within the regulator that is going to then be your contact person. And I feel like that's where we don't even really talk about this, is in Australia, is developing the talent pool, right? Investing and funding the research into law and policy, right? Bringing up people who are the best of the best and saying, you're a lawyer, go into space law, right? How about you go work for the regulator? Funding that, creating scholarships, creating fellowships, creating training, investing in building up institutional knowledge and capacity and talent within the regulator, as well as outside it. Yeah.
I guess just as a comparison, look at the ACCC. In terms of the talent pool they've built up over time with consumer regulation, a whole range of those sort of things. And again, dealing with the ACCC, you are understanding what the regulator is expecting. You've got to have a long period of time.
Yes.
So again, that overarching regulatory authority with talent is something which sounds like it's essential for developing our space policies and laws and regulations going forward.
I think so. And we are starting to see, there is, again, I always like to say, what the Australian government's doing well, not just always what they're doing not so well. And we are seeing more engagement in here. We are seeing the Australian Space Agency, drawing in talent, but in particular, say SIAA, and I'll mention that they've created sort of working groups and particularly, working policy groups. And there is that engagement happening now between the Australian, government and sort of our industry expert and leaders, and we just need to see more of it.
Moving sort of towards sort of national security militarization, space is increasingly a focus of national security, sovereignty, military issues. What are some of the hardest governance questions raised by counter-space capabilities and your use technologies? And Catherine, you touched on your use technologies about organisations need to do that just to simply be commercially competitive. But what are some of those potential risks?
The biggest risk for Australia is that what happens if we can't rely on our allies and partners? Where does that leave our military? Where does that lead our necessary systems for day-to-day life, whether it's PNT, position, navigation, and timing, or it's weather forecasting, or it's planting our crops? So I think the number one question that comes to mind for me when you talk about risk for space beyond governments or regulatory or dual use is like, what happens if we don't have our partners? And if the answer to that is we're screwed or we can't access the systems that we need, yes, then that's where we need to start. And whether you address that by building sovereign systems or whether you address that by building interdependent systems to where your partners need you as much as you need them, that is sort of where you start there. In terms of regulation, when it comes to dual use technology, increasingly almost all technology is dual use right now. There's very little technology that you can say is purely for commercial use or purely for civil use. So I think we need to start from the assumption that all technology is dual use technology. Just like we should always start that space is a political militarized domain, and it always has been. So to sort of live in a world where that's not true is just to live in a world that doesn't reflect the reality in which we sit. So I think we have to start from a point of that we need to consider all space technology having the potential for dual use, and we need to consider regulation that needs to address both commercial and military uses. And whether that's in terms of access, where we put our investments, how we build redundancy into the system, I think those are the important considerations there. But I think that this can't just be a domestic conversation because we have no ability and would never be able to build a completely sovereign system or a sovereign space ecosphere, biosphere, not sure the right term there. We just don't have that ability. We don't have the capital to do that. We just don't. And it's just, not realistic. So we need to look at where do we look at regulation in terms of how we use space with our partners, and then look forward to how do we make sure that our partnerships and our allies stay our partners and allies and remain trustworthy when we're using their data. And we do that through investment. Like one of the really important things that we invest in has been like the Landsat satellites, and we've invested those for decades. We have invested in the Landsat Next program. The future of that program is a little up in the air. Because it is, a program with lots of international partners, but it is a US program. So just being aware of that all technology should be looked at as dual use technology, but also just being aware of like the risk that we are exposed to based on the decisions that we make for our space and where we put our space. And it's a balancing act. And I think I was just at a workshop last week and we talked about sort of like satellite connectivity and regional space. And one of the important things is sort of creating intentionally interdependencies with our closest partners, whether they're partners here within our home area in the Indo-Pacific, or whether that's partners further abroad, whether it's the EU or the US or something like that. So that just needs to be front of mind when thinking of regulation and governance, but also I think front of mind for providers within the space industry, for companies within the space industry. Where do you sort of diversify your portfolio?
So I'm going to address one of the questions that has come through the chat from David, and I'll just read it out because I don't know if everyone's got the chat up, but he asked, are we looking to develop a broader national strategy, or is the focus more on strengthening space-related regulations, or both? I think my answer is, if you're asking me what the Australian government is doing, it might well be neither, which was not an option you put there, David, so I'm just adding it. So potentially neither. We're not at the moment, we don't have as far a national space strategy, and our space regulations under the Space Launches and Returns Act hasn't been updated. So the answer is kind of neither. So, but that doesn't mean we're not going to do something going forward. So moving forward, I think we need to do both, actually. I think we need to look at developing that national strategy across the top. And really, I think, Kat, you hit it on off the table there with the fact that because it's dual use, and because we have national security, because we have military concerns, because we have the need to have international partnerships, and the way the world currently is at the moment, that what would happen if our space systems and reliance on our space assets was interrupted. We need to have that national strategy, and then we need to have a strengthening of our space related regulations that follow that strategy. And I think one thing I'll mention here, sort of linking it back to the topic we have going, is really interesting, is we know, as Kat said, that space underpins almost every aspect of our daily lives, and this actually came out a few weeks ago where they revealed the findings of the independent review into SOCI, the Security of Critical Infrastructure Act. And there you have a number of sectors, and space is listed as a critical infrastructure sector here in Australia. But then in this table that you can find in that review, in addition to the sector of space itself, with every other sector, every sector that we have listed as critical infrastructure, space was listed either as a primary dependency or a secondary dependency, right? So space is relevant to every sector of our critical infrastructure in Australia. And because of that, we need to have, this pathway forward. We need to have it be deliberate. We need to work out the framework, work out our strategy at a national level, our policy, our goals, and how we're going to move forward. That includes our position for national regulation, that includes our position for international collaborations and international partnerships with our allies and partners, and this also then includes our investment into technological capabilities, which sits above that. There's your answer, David.
Lots to do. I know we're getting close to time, and a couple of final questions. Now, this is about public opinion legitimacy and what matters for governance. This might be something which is in your bailiwick. Space governance isn't just technical and legal. It relies on legitimacy and sustained political will. So how do public opinion, political communication, and national narratives shape what is possible in space policy? For example, what have we learned from surveying public opinion about what resonates or concerns people when it comes to space?
Yeah, so I think in Australia, national security. Sorry, let me just have a little bit of a drink.
While she's doing that, I'm going to jump in and give her a statistic which you can use. I think there was a recent statistic that I saw floating around from a survey, and it was posted on LinkedIn, where they said it was over 50%, might be 54 or 58% of adults
who
watched the Artemis launch in Australia. This is Australian adults. So I think that's really telling about how much we care about space generally, and that is increasing now, and things like Artemis really do put it back into the mainstream public view. Now,
well, I was going to say that the interesting thing on that is that more Australians pay attention to the activities of NASA than the Australian Space Agency. But when you
Star Trek, perhaps.
but when you look and survey, things that are really important to people are the economy, and Australians see the see space as a way that we can improve the national economies. They see it as an important driver for the economy, but they also see it as a source for jobs. So that's something that's important. Australians also think that we should be spending money on space and space research. When we surveyed NASA, we were actually, they thought we should spend a lot of money in terms of percentage compared to what we actually spend. But that's sort of an artifact of doing public opinion surveying. People can't conceptualize large numbers. It's just difficult. And when you get into even the millions, but especially into the billions, it's just difficult for people to understand where that money is going. There's something else that happens too when we survey people. When you put an actual price tag, support goes down.
It's really interesting. Right.
Yeah,
It's too real then, right?
it is too. But in terms of, but the way that space is communicated to the public is really important, because the way that we communicate space helps them to attach value or not attach value to space. And so investing in public communication and public programs that let people know how we spend money in space and what the benefit is we get back from that is really important. NASA does this really well. They have something called FinOps, and they do a yearly report on space technology. But they have an incredible budget to do that as well. And and the very sort of well-known, if you study NASA at all, is like NASA isn't a space program, it's a jobs program. NASA puts money into every single state in the US, and the local offices have legislative affairs office that go back and talk to elected representatives about that money. That's why even when you see administrations cut the NASA budget, there are times when Congress will go back and put even more money than the administration asked for into that, because it has been marketed as a jobs program, and elected officials really do see NASA as a jobs program. It's also seen as national pride, and there is a lot, and this cuts across party lines. It doesn't matter who you are. It's very interesting. I'm working on 2 projects right now. One is a follow-up on the public opinion survey with my co-author, Dr. Tristan Moss, who's at UNSW Canberra, also a member of ACSG and a visiting fellow with us at the center, the US Study Center this year, where we're going to do focus groups and sort of drill down in like, what are these things that come across? Why do people think space is important or not? What messages cut across? The other project I'm looking at is how space is used as a tool for memory and propaganda. So how space we continue to go back, especially in the US, and I'm more looking at the US context in this, but we have it here with sort of the dish in Australia as well, how it becomes used as a political tool to then justify further exploits in and out of space. So, you'll often hear within political speech in the US, like, we're the country who stepped on the moon, so we can do this, right? Like when President Biden announced his cancer initiative, it's called a moonshot, right? So it really goes into the character of a nation. And I think that has been an intentional position by the US government. And I think Australia needs to be intentional about how we put space into the conversation, because we do rely on it. It is really important. And it's not spending money on nothing. It's spending money on technologies that directly benefit every Australian citizen.
And I think that's so important to convey to our parliament and our federal government, because that always becomes the question of, why do we care, right? In terms of why would we invest money here? Why do we care? And I think that is all about language and about how we convey to the public that they should care, which then feeds back in to the government as to why they need to invest in this area.
One of the biggest conversations in Australian sort of cost of living, talking as the cost of medical, or to deal with medical, we should really highlight the research that we support in space. There was recently, again, it was done on the International Space Station, which is Australia is not a partner of the International Space Station, but we do have done research on the International Space Station. But there's research that changed the way that we deliver chemotherapy, that took chemotherapy from people having to come in and spend 2 hours in an office for an infusion to a 1-minute subcutaneous injection. I mean, that's incredibly life-changing. Like, that's not life-changing for a cancer patient, which it is, but also that frees up time of doctors, of nurses. It's incredibly cost-saving. So we really need to think about what we do in space, and all of our commercial companies that do who allow for launches or who do space tracking and debris, who do that, they actually all support that research, because we can't operate the ISS unless we're tracking space debris, unless we're using, Australia is a partner in ground. Like, we have more ground stations, US ground stations in Australia than anywhere else in the world except for the United States. So like, they couldn't operate the International Space Station with us. So we do enable that research. And that's the kind of message we need to get to the Australian citizen about the importance of space.
Excellent. Well, we've hit 1 o'clock, so I think we need to wrap it up. We could talk for a lot more time. It's a fascinating area, and there's lots of things to unpack. But no, thank you very much for your time today. It's been much appreciated and very valuable, and I'm pretty sure our attendees would attest to that as well if they could actually clap and applaud. But as we end, just a couple of things as well, which SIAA is putting on. On the 19th of June, there is the second Australia Space Law and Policy Conference, and SIAA is a major supporter of that. And also on 11th to 12th of August, it's SIAA's flagship event, which is the 2026 Southern Space Conference. So if you are interested in the space sector, which clearly you all are, these are some great events to get along to. So grab some tickets, come along, and it'd be fantastic to meet some of you down at these events. So thank you once again for the time today, and we look forward to connecting with everyone else in the near future. So thank you very much.